So we'll begin by establishing our motivation. So we generate minds of confidence in the Buddha's teachings, a mind of refuge, understanding Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners who deeply understand his teachings, like Lama Tsongkhapa, Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa, to be undeceptive, unmistaken, reliable guides, in whom we can fully trust. And wanting to engage in the study of the Lamrim for the purpose of becoming a Buddha ourselves, which is done not for one's own benefit alone, but principally to be of benefit to others, to unlock our potential to be of perfect benefit. So we take as our motivation these minds of refuge and bodhicitta, and confidence or faith. So we're continuing on in the Great Scope, the section on bodhicitta. We were dealing with the website problem. Discombobulated. So we are on day 287. Does anyone have a question from last class before we start with day 287? So day 287, as I mentioned, for a while now, for the next while, Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe are going to be discussing the benefits of bodhicitta. So the quotation is Bodhisattva or uneducated has earned the title, quote, child of the Buddhas. Also, the same thing, son or daughter of the conquerors is another translation that you often see, because the path of a bodhisattva is one that we have to pass through in order to become a Buddha. It's a necessary step along the way. We can bypass the path, the vehicle of an arhat in order to become a Buddha. That isn't necessary, but it is necessary to engage with the bodhisattva path. So when a person becomes a bodhisattva, then they are destined for Buddhahood. When their bodhicitta becomes stable, and then they will. It still could take quite some time, It isn't necessarily something that happens shortly thereafter, but they have entered the actual sort of last vehicle that will generate their enlightenment. So then they are referred to as, um, son or daughter of the conquerors, because they will grow up to also be like that. Day 288, Lama Zopa saying, even a new bodhisattva outshines the arhat. And then in the discussion, it says, with bodhicitta, we outshine the arhats, the hearers, and the solitary realizers. So these are other vehicles. These are the individual enlightenment or individual liberation vehicles. The hearers are those who independence upon, like in the sutras, you find people achieving arhatship, left and right in every sutra, every discourse of the Buddha, the people that the Buddha is addressing. People are getting these realizations because they are primed for that. And so they are called hearers because they are achieving arhatship, independence upon a connection with a wheel turning Buddha, like Shakyamuni Buddha, and they are appearing within the retinue of a wheel turning Buddha and getting teachings. And of course, they've been ripened, their continuums have been ripened over long periods of time, but finally, when they achieve arhatship, it's kind of independence upon manifesting at a time and place when there is a wheel turning Buddha and they're hearing the words and their independence upon that. And then there are solitary realizers, which they kind of have a predisposition, as it says, that's sort of more solitary. Their their arhatship occurs generally in a time and place when there isn't a wheel turning Buddha. They still have had a long history, a long period of their mental continuum being ripened by great teachers, Buddhists perhaps, but typically they realize their final path of training when there aren't wheel turning Buddhas around, kind of in a solitary sort of. These are people sort of are drawn to just sort of going off and meditating on their own away from anyone else, and moving it through that path. So those are the two typical individual liberation paths of arhats. So it says the arhats certainly have incredible qualities. They've realized emptiness directly and so on, but they don't have the unique, even they have it, it'll go on to say in further contemplations that the love and the compassion that they have for sentient beings compared to an ordinary person is extraordinary. But the step of what we would call the unusual attitude of individual responsibility is something that's absent from that vehicle, the determination to not only just hope or wish that all sentient beings also were free from suffering, but to actually take responsibility for bringing all sentient beings to a state beyond suffering. That unique attitude is part of the great scope, and it's not something that you find in the individual vehicle. And so that kind of determination, because it is in relation to every sentient being without exception, is something that goes far beyond what you find in the individual vehicle. And then, as we've said, it goes on to explain that the arhats are absorbed in this blissful meditative equipoise on emptiness. But it does, we've alluded at least once or twice sort of recently, that there are obstacles created to full enlightenment by traversing through the path of individual liberation. One of those obstacles is described here, which is that they are abiding in this really blissful state. It's kind of it's a very, very deep absorption, and it's incredibly light and blissful, and they are, as long as they remain in that absorption, there is no suffering that appears to the mind. And we all know, that our own suffering has in various ways motivated, even more so than seeing suffering or understanding suffering. One's own experience of suffering is a highly motivating factor, concern about death and so on, the different personal sufferings and fears. They're a powerful motivator for practice, and the arhats are completely free of that. And so that is a real obstacle to having them transcend that absorption. It says, when arhats are absorbed in the blissful state of peace, they experience such inconceivable happiness that they remain in equipoise meditation for, here it says, many eons before awakening to enter the Mahayana path. So we've said that, from the Mahayana perspective, fully enlightened beings, just like they can work for the benefit of ordinary sentient beings, they can also work for the benefit of arhats. They can appear to arhats, and they can kind of attempt to rouse them from that equipoise and encourage that they continue training along the path. But that is such a intensely blissful state that it's quite difficult. It says, during the length of time an arhat stays in that blissful state, a sentient being in the hells, a sentient being in the hells could have experienced the suffering of the hell realm, fully exhausted that karma, and been reborn as a human with a perfect human rebirth, entered the Mahayana path, and achieved enlightenment. So when you think of, and of course by achieved enlightenment, this is, so on the basis of the sutra teachings, the presentation of achieving enlightenment, the average kind of mean time is 3 countless great eons, just for achieving enlightenment. And then, of course, there are many, many eons that a sentient being would remain in the hell realms prior to that portion of what's being discussed. So it's an inexpressible period of times. The word eon itself has different meanings. There's great eons and intermediate eons, and countless great eons. There's different kinds of eons. So if just the word eon itself doesn't necessarily it's not clear exactly, but a countless great eon is the time that it takes a universe to abide and to be born, to abide, and to be destroyed. So that's trillions of made up Earth years, just for one countless gradion. And 3 of those is the average time for enlightenment on the sutra path. So we're talking tens and tens of trillions of years.
It's not that long.
So again, kind of an advertisement here, as I said, for following the Mahayana path directly. The understanding is that all sentient beings will end up in Buddhahood, but there are reasons that a person might not detour through the path of individual liberation. Any thoughts or questions so far? Yep.
Well, first off, thank you for teaching. It's nice to see you. I was just going to ask, so you kind of actually just alluded to it from what you just said, but there seems to be, at least from what I've just personally studied, a distinction between what perhaps on the Theravada path they would call enlightenment and what in the Mahayana teaching is what's called enlightenment. Can you expound upon that a little bit? Because there seems to be there's liberation and then there's enlightenment, at least from studying, Lama Zopa. From a Mahayana point of view, there seems to be almost a liberation and then an extra, a full liberation. So I was just wondering if you could speak.
So the path of an arhat, the path that's followed in the you could say Theravada tradition, but it's sort of technical. There's different words that are kind of more technical, or but the path of a person seeking individual liberation, individual enlightenment is because you could. It's just depending on how technical or precise you want to be. It's sometimes called lower nirvana and higher nirvana, individual enlightenment versus full enlightenment, the individual vehicle versus the great, the universal vehicle. So the idea is, and it's not seen in the Theravadan tradition or in the path of those that are seeking individual liberation through the vehicle of the arhat, the ideal of the arhat. Their presentation of it is also a bit different than the Mahayana understanding, or the Mahayana presentation of even that goal. But from the Mahayana perspective, these are 2 paths that are both taught, by the Buddha. They're both taught in the different sutras by the Buddha for persons of different dispositions. It's understood that the Buddha's ultimate intent, his ultimate goal was or is that every sentient being end up as a Buddha, end up fully awakened. But that as he was teaching, as he was traveling, there were people who weren't suitable to be given teachings on the Bodhisattva path, the Bodhisattva ideal, because they, if you go too quickly with some people, they would just reject the whole thing. They wouldn't be, they wouldn't make any progress. They would just, they weren't prepared. Their mind wasn't ready for that. And so the Buddha didn't, present the same thing to every person that he came across. He presented what was appropriate for that practitioner or that group. And then for a different group who had different karma, he would present a different, way of understanding. So individual enlightenment or lower nirvana is a meditative absorption on emptiness, on the nature of reality in the mind of that person. And it's distinguished from full enlightenment or Buddhahood in that practitioner, they have validly seen the nature of reality. They are able to remain absorbed in it, and therefore their mind, as Geshe Sherrod was just saying, the other day, if you can get to a point where craving and grasping are completely obliterated, completely extinguished from the mind, then you can no longer trigger ordinary karmic seeds. And so you would no longer participate in cyclic existence. Your mind would continue, your mind would, exist. But if you remain absorbed in that meditative concentration, your mind is existing, but can't experience the reality of ordinary suffering sentient beings. But there are what are called the subtle obscurations to omniscience or to knowledge. It's just that's not two different things, it's just two different translations of the same thing. Sometimes they'll call it obscurations to knowledge, sometimes they'll call it obscurations to omniscience, but it is really omniscience. It's the knowledge of all things. And a person can achieve a level of the path where they have achieved arhatship, they have achieved individual liberation, but they haven't gone a little bit further and removed those subtle obscurations, those obscurations to omniscience, those obscurations to knowledge. And so they're blocked from full enlightenment, but not blocked from remaining in this meditative equipoise on emptiness, separate. So their mind is just sort of abiding separately as mind without taking ordinary form. So they have no suffering, but they also describe, even though, in the teachings, they would say that even though the arhat is absorbed in this incredibly blissful state, the bliss, even just the bliss of a Buddha that they are subjectively experiencing is exponentially greater. So they kind of say, we've looked at some of the disadvantages of kind of detouring. They say even like selfishly, you're kind of not even achieving your own highest even from just an enjoyment perspective. In a way, there's a state of bliss and contentment that the Buddhas are experiencing that the arhats are not experiencing. The other implication is that a fully enlightened being can emanate their consciousness back into ordinary cyclic existence for the benefit of the ordinary beings who inhabit it. And an arhat, they're not mad about anything, they're having a good time, but they can't do that. Their mind is cut off from ordinary cyclic existence. Until, again, when they're aroused from that state and they're exhorted to train further, and then they eventually can. But as we mentioned, they've also kind of familiarized their mind with seeking a path that was just for themselves. And so that imprint in the mind is also an obstacle. Because for such a long time, the vehicle that they were directed toward, it was being reinforced that, like, well, you can have compassion for sentient beings, you can hope that they also follow in this path, you can, give them information, you can help to create conducive conditions, but you can't actually achieve enlightenment. I mean, even in the Theravadan tradition, they still have the understanding of the Bodhisattva path, and they have the understanding of Buddhas, but in general, for the most part, it's viewed as something that is reserved for an incredibly small number of practitioners. Um, it's not practical for practitioners in general. Um, so, the message has been sort of reinforced that, kind of just follow a path for your own benefit. And then, along the way, help your fellow humans to do the best that they also can do. But this idea of having a state where your mind continues forever and ever in the state of full enlightenment, and you're using that actively to work for the benefit of ordinary sentient beings. They don't have that. That's not something that they're being presented with as like, try to do that, as like that's the path that you should be kind of following. And I mean, you find within different countries in the you certainly find practitioners who feel um, uh, drawn to the bodhisattva ideal, and they're integrating some of the bodhisattva trait. So it's not black and white. It isn't. There's not like a hard distinction for all practitioners, but in general, what's generally being presented is um, the ideal of the arhat, rather than the ideal of the bodhisattva as being what's achievable, what's practical, and what most people should kind of strive for.
Yeah, I would say like especially now in the West, probably as traditions are mixing like more and more, I think probably more people are talking, communicating, sharing ideals. So yeah, thank you.
On day 289, the moment we attain bodhicitta, we are revered by all and become a supreme object of offering. So here, this is, well, we're now, going solidly into sort of this list of 10 historical benefits of bodhicitta. Um, and this can sound, kind of self-centered in a way. This can kind of sound like, well, how cool would I be if and that's not how we're really meant to think of this. We're kind of meant to see that as like a beacon in the world for sentient beings. So, it says when we become a bodhisattva, we become a supreme object of offering for all sentient beings. Other beings accumulate incredible merit by making offerings to us, and we ourselves accumulate incredible merit. So it isn't that like we're thinking about it in an egoistic way, but like, how amazing is it that sentient beings have an object that they can relate to in that way, and thereby get merits themselves. So it's kind of like it's just an extension of wanting to be wish fulfilling for sentient beings. It's like, well, if I achieve this, then all of the people that I'm connected to, they will be sped along their spiritual trajectory because of their relationship, with me, and being able to accumulate such vast merit by, being able to be in relation to me. And so it's kind of like recognizing that the world needs more and more of these, beacons or touchstones for enlightenment for the benefit of others. Not that the bodhisattvas are wanting to be venerated or receiving offerings, but they realize that it shapes, culture, and it impacts groups and people in really positive and beneficial ways. Uh, then day 290, Lama Yeshe says, if we want to succeed in the business of collecting merits, we must have bodhicitta. So merit is a pretty common concept in Buddhism. It is usually understood as kind of like spiritual momentum or force, kind of like a spiritual inertia in a way. Like the more habituated we are to virtue, the easier that path becomes, for us, and becomes sort of second nature. The more we are habituated to virtue, and the more commonplace it would be. And so we would simply, for us at the beginning, there's a lot of our inertia isn't necessarily virtuous, inertia. We're kind of move away from, the inertia of non-virtue, because we've been habituated to that over beginningless past lives. But the more that we can put effort into our spiritual practice, then that shifts, more and more over time. And it's like, a stone rolling downhill and gathering more and more. It would just kind of seem unthinkable, at a certain point, that a person would cause harm to others, or a person would avoid, would pass up opportunities to engage in virtuous activity. And so, as best we can, if we make our motivation bodhicitta, if we make that the central focus of our spiritual lives, then all of that process that I was, describing, where we want to turn away from non-virtue, we want to embrace virtue, having that at the core of everything that we're doing, makes that whole process actually work, rather than having, more self-centered, because it's wholly focused on wanting to be of benefit to others and getting out of our own way, tamping down the self-grasping, self-cherishing mind that we're so deeply familiar with, and letting go of that and focusing on cherishing others. So the more that is the essence of our practice, then we'll find it easier and easier to do all of the parts of the path. Going along with that, we've talked in the various chapters about purification and the different ways that we purify negative karma. We talked about formal practice, like 35 confession bodhi practice, Vajrasattva practice, but then also just the process of becoming more and more familiar with the antidotes to non-virtue, and causing those virtuous pathways in the mind to become stronger. And necessarily, the stronger those pathways are, they are directly in competition with the non-virtuous pathways. So the more moments we have in a day when we are concentrated on genuine love, genuine compassion, we're having fewer thoughts of, ill will, anger. That is just, there's only so many mental moments in a day. And so the more and more mental moments that are directed at virtue, at generosity and patience and ethics and love and compassion and all of these virtuous states, necessarily in those moments, the mind can't be concentrated on maliciousness and ill will and greed and envy and jealousy and all of the problematic states of mind. And so here the quotation all negative karma and obscurations are completely burnt up in the intense fire of bodhicitta. So again, to the extent that we can do everything in our lives as best we can, with where we are in the path at that time, thinking about having that bodhicitta motivation, then the quicker and more intensely we are purifying all of our ill will and our hatred and accept all of the things, all of the examples, that I gave, because bodhicitta is directed, all of that negative karma is and was directed at sentient beings, at, kind of using sentient beings for our own selfish purposes, thinking of them as a way to get more power or to get more comfort or to feed our egoistic self preoccupation in various ways. And bodhicitta is the complete opposite of all of those mistaken ways of relating to sentient beings. So it has an incredibly powerful, purifying effect on the mind itself. Just the more times that throughout the day that we can think of engaging in actions with a bodhicitta motivation, even if it's, just going to work or feeding the body or, speaking to someone, speaking to a friend or socializing with someone. We can think that the purpose of all of those activities is to create relationships, karmic relationships with the sentient beings that we want to eventually lead to their enlightenment. And so we're creating virtuous karma in relation to them. We're creating karmic connection in relation to them, for the purpose of being able to be the one who leads them to enlightenment. And then, of course, thinking, that's just one example. One sentient being, but I also want to lead every sentient being also to enlightenment. And so I'm also using that opportunity to develop, the qualities of my own mind that will ripen my mind to be someone who can achieve enlightenment. And so I'm practicing ethics, I'm practicing generosity in order to ripen my own mental continuum to have the kind of mind that's capable of being fully enlightened, at some point down the road. So, essentially, the more times in a day, in a week, that we can generate some thoughts along those lines, we are counteracting all of our normal, deeply ingrained, more egoistic ways of thinking and acting, and that's incredibly powerful. Of course, we've also said, meditate, recollecting emptiness is another, incredibly powerful kind of purification, but that's also available to those on the individual vehicle. This is, unique. This is a unique way of being able to purify. it says here the great teachers say that just one meditation session of training in bodhicitta will leave an impression on the mind that is more powerful and beneficial than 100 years of continuous purification without bodhicitta motivation. It says the stronger our bodhicitta motivation, the stronger and more effective our confession will be. So, talking about here is talking about joining, here specifically is talking about joining formal purification practice with the mind of bodhicitta. And then it says, with that strong bodhicitta motivation, strong negativities created over several lifetimes can be purified in a very short time. So again, we may, we have two options, in front of us. We could see purification practice still as important in order to achieve individual liberation. That's still validly true. Or we could even see it just, it could even serve a less meaningful purpose. Those on the small scope are also going to see the value of purification practice simply to close the door to the lower realms for just oneself. So there are valid reasons why practitioners, and those are, there's nothing invalid or mistaken about either of those ways of engaging in purification practice, but of the three, doing it either to just fully close the door to the lower realms, doing it to achieve individual liberation, or doing it to achieve full enlightenment, of those three, doing it to achieve full enlightenment is the most powerful, has the most intensity behind it, has the most power and strength behind it. So, and therefore, it will actually be more effective than the other two, which have elements kind of self-grasping that are still there. It's still very, very much directed at oneself, whereas, the bodhicitta motivation is not. And, really, if we're trying to even just see emptiness directly, the more we can weaken our egoistic self-concern, the easier that's going to be. And the more, the more that we can avoid that egoistic self-preoccupation, the easier it will be to turn away from the impulse to steal or to lie or to kill, or because those are all very self-serving, motivations. Any thoughts or questions? Okay. I won't memorialize that for the video, but so again, talking still, trying to sell us on this idea of bodhicitta. The benefits are still what we're discussing. So day 291, I'm sorry, day 292. With bodhicitta, we can easily accomplish whatever we wish without being bothered by internal or external hindrances. That's Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And then in the commentary, it says, another benefit is that we accomplish whatever we wish. So, and that means whatever work we undertake will be completely successful. Not only that, because we're working solely for others, whatever we do will be completed without much effort. So, here, of course, I think they're talking in still kind of longer time scales. They're not necessarily talking about, because when we're talking on the time scales of eons, a couple thousand years, is pretty quick. And, so of course we know that not everything is necessarily perfectly coming to fruition over, just in one lifetime, 30, 40 years. But of course, it's also true that we're talking about, genuine bodhicitta and not just the respect for bodhicitta that we, are kind of this is talking about practitioners who genuinely have bodhicitta, and then of course how they things are much easier with that motivation, which I guess is sort of a more esoteric or more hidden sort of karmic aspect of that energy that's there. So then, it's just further explaining day 293, a bodhisattva is always protected by the power of bodhicitta. So kind of talking about, they sometimes a phrase like impervious to interfering forces, and things like that, and how bodhisattvas can bless certain places just by being there, and how they, their body and mind, being wish fulfilling for sentient beings, carries with it blessing energy, and so things are, environmental harms can be pacified, malevolent kind of energies can be pacified through the blessing energy of an actual bodhisattva. Day 294, when we have bodhicitta, realization pour down on us like cooling rain without much effort. From Lama Zopa. With bodhicitta, every action creates infinite merit, because again, sentient beings are, pretty close to infinite in number, and you want for them perfect, unsurpassed happiness and freedom from suffering, not just, ordinary levels of not just the kinds of harms that we see, thinking, oh, well, may no one ever have cancer, or may no one ever have a heart attack. Those are wonderful motivations. But this is, thinking about every suffering that sentient beings experience in every realm within all of cyclic existence, and wishing them to be free of that, and also to possess that, inexpressible depth of bliss that comes with the fully enlightened state. So every action that a bodhisattva does, is reinforcing that, and so the force of that means that they will progress through the path, the remaining grounds and paths up to full enlightenment, very quickly. Again, very quickly can mean 3 countless great eons, but when we're talking in these, cosmic timescales, compared to an infinity of time, at least it's, it's bounded. And then with the Vajrayana teachings, it's a little bit different in terms of how quickly it even, of course, we still have to have bodhicitta motivation to make the Vajrayana path work. It doesn't work with a self-centered attitude. But in that body of knowledge, it's even presented as being more quickly than that. So, it says specifically, we're quickly able to complete the two merits of method and wisdom and achieve the two kayas, the Dharmakaya and the Rupakaya, the holy mind and the holy body of the Buddha. Without bodhicitta, we might be able to complete the merit of wisdom, but never the merit of method. Because again, the bodhisattvas are engaging in the six perfections. They're engaging in the perfection of generosity and morality and ethics and patience and wisdom and joyous effort and concentration. And so that's unique, that path of training. They are progressing through the bodhisattva grounds and paths, and they're engaging in these six perfections. And so they're the storehouse of merit that they are accumulating in relation to the method side of things, that actual engagement with sentient beings and actually perfecting their generosity and perfecting their patience and perfecting their ethics and so on is necessary to complete. That's again going back to that distinction between these subtle obscurations that continue to abide the mind of a practitioner who has achieved individual liberation but not achieved full enlightenment, and very much related here to this path of training that is dependent upon bodhicitta and dependent upon engaging in the six perfections, which is what a bodhisattva does. It says, whatever Mahayana path we take to enlightenment, the Paramita path or the Vajrayana path. So the Bodhisattva, in the Paramita Yana, it says path twice here. Well, no, it says vehicle and path, which I guess is different. So the Bodhisattva path or the Vajrayana path, still bodhicitta it says is the vital ingredient. It says we can spend our whole life progressing through the stages of Vajrayana, the generation of completion stage. But without bodhicitta, none of this is a Mahayana action, and it will not be the cause for enlightenment. It cannot serve as a karmic cause for enlightenment without being motivated by bodhicitta. All right, so that's all we have time for today. Covered a lot of the contemplations. Any thoughts or questions? Yes, no.
No, thank you.
All right. So we will end there. So we'll end with dedication. So we recollect our altruistic intention and think that by having listened and contemplated, we've actualized that motivation which has created positive energy in our mind. We think that we offer that positive energy, the fruit of our practice, for the benefit of every sentient being without exception. sealing it, dedicating it for its ripening in spirit, specifically spiritually beneficial ways. So bring to mind the spiritually beneficial ways that you are offering the result, the fruit of your practice, very clearly visualizing that ripening result. Right. We will pick it back up on Thursday.